All right, so it's just uploading to YouTube now, and then I'll send the link across, and then I'll make a start. Right, 2 seconds.
I got it here. You're all right.
You got it there? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Phil, just send that to you. All right, so we are live on YouTube now and also recording. Welcome everybody to the third of our Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland webinar series. Hope everybody is safe and well wherever you are in the world. Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland is comprised of Ed Collin, Phil Carney, Alan Dunton and myself. And originally we planned to have our second conference event in gloriously sunny Cork today and tomorrow. However, situations have changed. We've had to adapt, no pun intended, Rick. And so we've decided to run a bit of a webinar series as a result. So we're really fortunate that a number of our speakers and presenters that we had scheduled in for that event have given up some of their time to come on to this webinar series. So, really thankful for them to that. And we've had a great response to the first two of our webinar series, which has been Sarah Kelleher and Professor Keith Davids. And they're currently on our YouTube channel, which is MSAI Ireland. So check those out if you haven't seen those. We're really keen to maintain a level of interaction during these webinars, and that's why we've chosen to limit it to 100 people. So if you have a question today for Rick, could you please post it in the comments section, and we'll look to come to you at the end of Rick's presentation and actually for you to ask Rick that question. We're also streaming live on YouTube. So if you're watching on YouTube, then can you please post any questions in the comments section, and we'll monitor those and post those to Rick through Alan or through Phil. And again, for those of you in the webinar, what we'll do is we'll mute you during the process of this, and then if you do have a question, we'll come to you and unmute you. So without further ado, I'm going to head over to Ed Collin, and Ed's going to just introduce our speaker for today.
Super, Ali, thanks, and welcome everybody. Just before we kick off, I'd like to bring it to everybody's attention that a friend of ours in Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland, Nick Winkleman, who's the head of athletic science and performance in the IRFU, is launching his book today, The Language of Coaching. And as far as skill acquisition and coaching texts go, I can speak personally, but also on behalf of us four here in MSAI, that this is a book that will make a very strong contribution to the discussion around coaching and skill acquisition, and is well worth checking out. We don't say that lightly. Yes, he's a friend of us and of ours, and he presented at our first conference in 2018. But it is also because it is worthy of being spoken about and checking out. So it brings me to our guest today, Ric Shuttleworth, a man who presented at our first conference in 2018, a man who personally, again, is probably the most significant influence on my coaching in the last 15 years, a guy who is known worldwide for his work as a practitioner, but also in more recent times as a contributor to research. And again, because of the impact he had in our conference back in 2018, he was coming back to Cork, ideally for today, in 2020 for a conference, just to hang out and be a facilitator. Such is the kind of engagement and interaction we know he can have with people, and the kind of questions he enjoys hearing, and the kind of answers he provides for people because of the range of experience that he brings to the table. So it's a great pleasure for the four of us to welcome Ric onto the webinar today. And Ric, away you go. Thanks, man.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks everybody on the organising committee for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think the topic is quite apt at the moment. Obviously, it feels strange currently what's happening in the world to talk about something like this and then having to switch back to real life a little bit. So I guess we've got to adapt, and today it's nice to sort of immerse yourself in some of this almost research and practice. And yeah, you know, me and Ed go back a long way, and I think yeah, today is talking about those experiences and those interactions with people like Ed and Phil, who I met in a conference, I think over in Portugal many years ago. And you know, similar minds sort of tend to sort of talk about these things like skill ac and adaptability. So I think what I'll do is I'll race through a few areas, and I'm not going to touch on all of these, but what I've got there is probably the only slide with some detail in there, and then we can keep reverting back to it. But I've looked at encouraging adaptability in our coaching as a theme for today, and to exploit the exploitation of movement degeneracy and pluripotentiality. They're big words, but let's dig a little bit deeper in terms of what that means in terms of practice. There's a number of things there I'd sort of look at as a practitioner to try and encourage adaptability. I think when you're sort of working with young kids, you look at sort of foundational movements or basic movement skills as something which needs to be adaptive really early on. And that gives somebody a really good platform in order to be adaptive in their sporting life or even their active life. So they participate in sports all their existence. So adaptive athletic development. And then we move on to having some sort of frameworks, which we just see a couple there, the interactive continuum, the movement effect continuum, which we'll talk a little bit about hopefully at the end. But moving on there to a couple of, well, 6 ways of implementing adaptability in training environments. One is setting metastable regions. And we'll go on about that in a minute with a few slides. I'll just move through those 6. And then the other is extending an athlete's maximum action capability. So pushing the limits of what they're actually capable of through their actions in respects to scaling to one's environment or equipment. The other is perturbing, so spontaneously and temporarily perturbing somebody in their practice environment or performance environment. The other is pushing the comfort zone. So you're almost inhibiting pre-existing movement patterns. So they're almost forced to try and find new ways of completing tasks. Supporting learning through primarily search, discover and exploit environmental resources. So instead of giving the perfect templates or expert models, we're actually learning to learn. And this is probably what Keith, I think, may have touched on last week, where we talked about this process of actually co-adaptation with your athletes and going on a journey with them through the practice session. And lastly, promoting exploration through the design of a landscape of affordances in training sessions. So let's go into that a little bit further and maybe some stimulus videos, and then we can sort of think of questions maybe, and we'll go into a Q&A for as long as we can. So the next few slides, do excuse me if I forward through a few of them and I don't show all of them. It just sort of depends on the flow of how we go. So setting metastable regions, probing boundaries. So if we look at that, here we have crossing in football or soccer, as some of you may call it. And here we've scaled the distance between the 2 posts. The reason being is the coach gradually moves those soccer posts in and out to give the players an ordinate amount of time and space in order to organize themselves as they go in and find any affordances in that time and space to be able to knock the ball in the back of the goal. That could be done in a very structured way, but this is not a structured way. This is where the players have to find their own role and find their own capability within this particular landscape. And this is quite a small field of affordances here where they have to find themselves. Okay, we can talk about that at the end. I'll just, the few comments is that it does look messy. The players tend to start off a little bit slow in transition between the two sides. They're wondering where the ball's coming in from, slightly chaotic. But they get a fair amount of organisation the more you go through games like this, to a point where really exploiting some of the affordances provided by the crosses and also the interpersonal distances between the players starts to be more coordinated. So you can do things also in the metastable region, like a particular researcher, John Korma, who's actually at NIE, I think, at the moment in Singapore, and he shared with me some stuff with Hawkeye that they've looked at the receiver in tennis, and I'm not a tennis expert here, so do forgive me, but when I've looked at these videos here, I as a skill practitioner, I look at the video and I start to think, how would I help somebody in terms of their ability to receive and actually return the ball. And if you look at this Hawkeye here has been done on the jump. So before you serve, they tend to sort of wriggle around a bit and jump and then land and then return the ball. So if we just look at this video, we'll have a good understanding of it. So just here, when I was watching the videos, and there may be some research on this, I don't know, but if I was doing an intervention right now, I looked at this and I try and find anchoring points. And here I sort of saw peak vertical height of the ball and coupled with movement initiation. So this is when the dial starts to move. And that's quite regular between all his returns. And he's moving, he's moving. The next anchoring point is ball contact, and that seems to be coupled with the start of his jump, and that seems to be quite continuous. So his feet will start to leave the ground just as the ball starts to get hit. I'm trying to remember what EBF was. I wrote it down there before. Early ball flight. So early ball flight, probably about 6 or 7 frames. This is probably 25 frames per second. So work that out. That's not long into the serve, but he's already landed, double foot landing. So he's landing quite early on in the ball flight to afford him some opportunities. And we'll just roll that forward. Provides him enough time to return that serve. So if we go look back at the Hawkeye information, it sort of shows here that the differences between juniors on the left and seniors, and the juniors tend to take off in their jumps. It's a bit in French here. So on the jump on the left, you've got the top, which I think is left foot, middle, which is double feet, and then the bottom, which is your right foot. And then the fly is in the middle of the jump. And then you land either on your left or double foot in the middle or your right foot at the bottom. So most of the juniors tend to land double foot. If you look at the right, there's an equal distribution, but the way they land seems to be equally distributed as well. So it seems to me, talking to John as well, is they put themselves into a situation here where they have options open to them by landing slightly differently, depending on that early ball flight information that comes from the early ball flight. Whereas the juniors are sort of putting themselves into a position where they're double-footed every time when they land. Watching Nadal, he seemed to be landing double-footed most of the time and then sometimes on his left foot. But I guess that would be constrained by the server as well. So you'd have to look into that in a proper study. But to me, also, to start to look at now, how could you force some adaptability in there to improve performance? And some simple things with task constraints would be looking at the anchoring points. I would try and use anchoring points and try and find that information coupling and manipulate those information sources. So hence the ball contact time, the toss, and early ball flight times. And I'm just thinking off the top of my head, you could actually vary the tennis ball pressure So the receiver would never know, but the server could just serve as normal. And some of those balls may be dampened in their ball flight. So it will affect the way the ball comes over. So if you get into your comfort zone as a receiver and do a jump, as if everything's going to be all normal, and then suddenly pick up on the ball that, ooh, it's a slight deviation here, or it's a bit slow, it's a bit fast, you have to adapt earlier in your motion. And if you've already launched into your movement, it's very difficult. So there's various ways, of course, you could probably be quite imaginative as well. So I'll let you sort of think about that. But this is just how I would work in my job as a skill acquisition person, as I look for the ways people coordinate their movements and look for couplings and anchoring points. And I generally would manipulate around those. Okay, so thanks to John Cormer from NIE for passing on that information. This is another metastable region. This is the Australian under-20 team before a World Cup, and I was running a few things at the AIS with them, and this was metastable region, which is going left or right from a ruck. And the way you would manipulate that is to reduce the number of phases to 2 phases. So it forces a team to have to determine which side is best for the second phase of attack. So you're trying to link 2 phases of attack because that's all you have. So you have to look at the defense, and you have to be very, very adaptable to what the affordances are presented to you, which will be different every time. So we'll just run through this tape, have a wee look. So it's a 3-team attack. They'll kick the ball. This team receives. They've got 2 phases. So they've popped it out and found their way through straight away. So they'll kick it to the next team and they defend. And that team has 2 phases to attack. So break down there. Will they find a way through? Yes, they have. They'll kick it through. And gradually what I've done is I've moved the distance in closer and closer and closer, giving them less time and space. See, he's found a way on the left there. He's now open and ready to perceive space, a little bit more sensitive to it. They popped around to the left. That's a 3-man transition from the right to the left. You won't normally see that in normal training sessions. So he's gone to ground, which he shouldn't really. That's more traditional. He should have stayed on his feet. So in here, turn. See, I've adapted some guys on their feet as well. So they haven't got much time and space here. They've got 2 phases. They have to be very open and very receptive to any opportunities that are in front. Okay, just aware of time. Another way of doing is extending maximal action capability. So pushing somebody. For example, in this rock climbing example here, rock surfaces are transversable for individual climbers, but in very specific, unique ways. So again, I'm no rock climbing expert, but there's a range of opportunities that are situated on a rock face. And if we look at that, this guy here is checking out the wall to see what affords his action capabilities, and his arm span, notice that, and his leg span, and how he tries to overcome this wall. Okay, the constraint would be you're not allowed to touch the bottom part of the wall, the grey bit, with your hands. Okay, on the rock face, so you can't hold any holds. He's got to find a way up there. So there's different ways you can constrain somebody to find out, how am I going to use my body to find a unique way? And that's really pushing someone to the boundaries. And I really encourage that sort of coaching with your athletes, and it is good fun too. Perturbing spontaneously and temporarily an individual's routine. So upsetting set behaviors in a way, perturbing them continuously. And some coaches are very good at this. And it's managed as well. It's not done frivolously. So you have to look at what you're trying to perturb and how you're going to do that. And I just wanted to show a quick clip of who I would recommend is one of a great skill acquisition specialists in terms of what he talks about in terms of his routines.
Since combat, like life, is not predictable, Lee held that one must possess a pliable adaptability in order to change with change.
You see, we rehearse routines like the flexibility to adapt. There's a way there.
So there was one event in the Olympic Games, and it was the 500 meter K1, and there was an Australian fellow who raced in it, and he was late for his race, and his coach seemed to be more perturbed than he was, and he so happened to be a surfer from the Gold Coast, and he said to his coach, "Don't worry, I'll be right, 15 minutes," and he adapted his warm-up, he adapted his whole routine, and it wasn't a problem for him because he grew up in the surf. He grew up with mixed routines and he knew what he needed to do in that time. So from that point on, I mean, that was back in 2006, going ready for the 8 games, I think it was. And at that time, you know, there were a lot of psychologists talking about pre-performance routines and nailing them and getting them very rigid and consistent. And it's sort of at that time, I'm also working in this area, looking at perturbing routines as well. And it came down to these athletes who were very aware of what information they needed to either stabilize or destabilize themselves moving into an event. Moving into Australian sailing, the sailors, half an hour before every event, and we're talking like number 1, number 3 in the world in the laser, they didn't want any information from the coaches about an hour before the event. They just wanted to tune into the environment. They just wanted to sail around, pick up information, and then be attuned and then regulate their own movements. And that was a regular routine that occurred. When we look at perturbing some skills, we've got the New Zealanders who tend to do quite a lot of contralateral movements, which will be passing here off the right hand with your left leg forward, which is not the biomechanically suggested way of doing it, i.e. textbook. So, but with this, you get an element of deception, and it's almost like a dissociation between the top and the bottom of the body. So you'd call it adaptability or multifunctionality. This pluripotentiality shows you that you can get the same outcome with many different ways of structures of performing it. So multiple options are afforded. So here you've got Danny Carter, quite deceptive. And what we're trying to do is generate that sort of coordination pattern within some of our players in England. So here we have a TheraBand, which I'm sort of tugging on here just to perturb during this passing motion. So if you look at this, what's the purpose is the emergence of a coordinated structure. We don't want to force it. We want it to emerge, but we're perturbing the environment and task constraints. There's no defender because they're pretty highly skilled, and decoupling that's fine with quite a highly skilled player. Fixed passer and a fixed receiver, so they're constrained with the starting point and the outcome where they've got to pass to. It's induced footfall variability, so you're stepping off, but you're also hurdling, and you've got to pass over the hurdle to get it to the guy in time. So there's quite rigid constraints on you there. They've got a very narrow space to search. The only instruction, pass over the hurdle. So what you notice is I've pulled him to the left and he's gone to the left of the hurdle. Okay, and he's also not passing off his left leg. Okay, he's actually gone to the standard way of doing it. And so that's what the pressure is forcing. Right, he has to try and actually get a contralateral movement. And he just goes and goes again and again. He wasn't aware that he didn't go over the hurdle. He asked a question and he thought he did, but he didn't. So this time he's gone over and he's done a contralateral movement. So yeah, right leg forward. It's quite a deceptive movement. So if you're a defender moving in there, very difficult to read whether he's going to step inside or whether he's actually going to pass on the outside. So those sort of movements can go into paired movements. So you put the the hurdles and the bands around them, and you go up and down. And the natural variance, they don't always pass over the hurdle, but eventually things start to work themselves out. They keep that equal distance, regular passing, and perturbations on footfall variability, which causes them to have to pass in certain positions. Okay, and this would then pass on to, well, what's the transfer? So you look at little small-sided games like 6-on-6. How can you use those movement repertoires to create opportunities and afford you space to penetrate? And so the analyst would look for those contralateral movements to see if they're actually generating any destabilizing any of the defenders. And those clips will be used. And we want it to naturally evolve. It's not a forced thing. And then you can look at global space. So those local interactions have a bidirectional effect. So they also affect the way your global team plays and how it operates in space. So the best way to do that, obviously, is through spatial cameras. And we won't go too long on that. Okay. Another way is to push people in their comfort zones. So constrain pre-existing patterns. Again, Bruce Lee, I loved his little comment here about fighting different styles. So if we just have a quick listen to Bruce.
His background in Hong Kong, which consisted not of non-contact karate tournaments, but full contact street fights and challenge matches fought on Hong Kong rooftops. When not fighting against proponents of different styles of gung fu on rooftops, Lee had also fought frequently against opponents who had been armed with knives and chains. In such real-world encounters, referees and judges were not necessary. Anything that's ornamental is discarded from his style. He retains only those techniques that he himself has determined to be practical in real self-defense situations.
To reach me, you must move to me. Your attack offers me an opportunity to intercept you.
Okay, so I don't think there is enough of the in practice environments, particularly when there's a lot of repetition of moving of opponents or changing partners. I think there needs to be more thought put into that, actually, in terms of the way we structure and order our sessions. So, for example, if something's starting to work, well, then the defender coaches the attacker and does something different, or you change and rotate your partners. So, in fact, you can implement a learning system within your playing group and your athletes that monitor these things, rather than the coach having to do it from the outside in. So some of these variables, I think athletes can actually regulate themselves to maintain the correct pressure on their own actions. Okay, this is just some perturbation training in, I think, Olympic water polo back in AIS, and former colleague Adam Gorman in the background. Okay, and you'll notice in some of those clips, the noodles changing at the last second. The girls became very sensitive to actually who was shooting the ball, knowing how they shoot and pushing them out of their capabilities by stretching that noodle and reshaping it. So there's a lot more to those things when you look at them. And I think the athletes start to get into why they're doing it, and they actually start working well together with each other. Another bit here is supporting learning to exploit environmental resources. And I think this is primarily a core aspect of an ecological dynamics approach when you look at coaching. And I think for me, even working with very, very technical sports, I think actually athletes can search and discover their own nuances and their own movement patterns. Even if it's subtly suggested through observations and guidance, videos, I actually think they can search their way if they provided with an opportunity to do that through their youth. It all depends on the needs of the athlete, of course. And I've been in many environments where you've got a range of people who can and can't. Of course, you can't suit everybody, but here primarily we're looking at search, discover, and exploit. A lot to do with intention and attention, and also guiding someone's intention. Particularly in team sports, we don't do that much. We focus on performance and outcomes and patterns and processes rather than actually, during play, coaching on the run. What were you trying to do there? And actually, I think guiding people's intentions, and then also that obviously influencing their attention, their perceptual attunement to create the affordances to satisfy their intentions. I think if you can create the need and the urgency and environments through the athletes, not onto them, through them and with them, I think you can actually get good behavior, which results in quite effectivity in your practice. When you exploit environmental resources, I think you tend to use passive and reactive in a very, very nice balanced way. In terms of individual coordination, obviously, there's a guy who's really, really good at this. With minimal effort, uses passive forces very, very well in a very skillful way.
I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush. Take my eyes off this reality. Why can't you just let me eat my way to glee? I live inside my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming.
You know, if we could only do that these days, Ed. So, you know, what great exploitation of environment there, and things like parkour and donor sports, and moving yourself into areas where you have to learn to require these sources and exploit them, I think is something that I'm sort of getting into more recently, actually, with some of the pathways. But Alexander Titarenko there, fantastic, absolutely. When we look at that, we tend to look at coaching as well to support that. And traditionally, we've got a reductionist approach, and probably at the other end there, a bit more of a systems. So we tend to use different facets there. On the left, for adaptability, we would go down the right-hand side more so, where we use principles for people to adapt to. On the left, it's more explicit rules, and that's more for control. So I would suggest for adaptability to shoot down the right-hand side a bit more there, a bit more dynamic, a bit more interaction. And the coach is a key component of that interaction in terms of what you manipulate and how those actions are guided through those information sources. When we look at that, the linear approach on the left tends to use more explain, demonstrate, imitate, and practice, the EDIP, and it's still quite common even through the forces. On the left there, we've got explore, discover, and adapt, an EDA approach, more non-linear. And I think that continuum is just a nice continuum there for you to shoot up and down it based on a needs basis. And I think on the right-hand side there is pretty much what today has been about, and also the prescriptive end can be used. Here's an example of an environment which Sonny Goldshire is exploiting completely, and completely immersed himself in there, just talking to somebody and having fun. And this is where he grew up, in this garage that he made for himself, shooting practice.
Oh, we go through. Whatever it goes, yeah. Like this. It's always.
Having fun. We'll talk about it more later with the questions, but very, very free movement form where he gets to explore movement forms, but very fixed endpoints, get them through those goals at either end. It's continuous. I will talk about that later. Different equipment you can use, light balls, perturbing the ball handling, half balls, which is quite common in our training sessions. It's used for finger dexterity. Smooth panels, it almost feels like it's a wet ball. So your haptic attunement. Soccer ball. And you have to adapt team play. So more about the team sports now, where the football actually encourages you to be more sensitive with your passes. A lot harder for the halfback, of course. It does promote ball movement around the pitch. And therefore, you've got to anticipate a bit quicker and get into space. Here you see Eddie Jones perturbing a set piece. They're not quite used to it. Look, they normally just do a scrum session generally, but this is early days. Suddenly into a counter attack. Suddenly the coaches were stuck in the middle. It's a run out the way. Now you've got great movement out the back here. Okay, and then we got promoting exploration through design of landscapes and affordances. So more nested constraints here we're sort of going to look at. Again, provided by John. I find this really interesting, and this can create some discussion as well. And hopefully if Keith is online, we can open up as well to Keith. But if we look here, we're trying to promote exploration through the design of a rich landscape of affordances moving up that wall. So these are general novices, I think, but we're looking for movement efficiency, which is minimal, which is fluency up the wall, basically, consistency and fluency of movement up the wall, a smooth ascent. Here, I think the only constraint is they've got one visible hole that lights up. So you can see just that light there guides her onto the next one. And she's figuring out which hand actually to reach for that next one, whether it be the same hand or a different hand. That she's changed, she's double-handed and then gone with her other hand, her left. It made sense not to go with the other one. So she's trying to figure that out. And she's been guided by a one visible hold. If we move on from that, the other constraint is a three visible hold. And so now an affordance pathway is sort of lit up 3 holes ahead now up that wall, which guides them to that. So it's reduced the complexity of opportunities available, but it's actually helped them scale that wall quite well. So the next one I think is a 5 visible hold. And of course here, it can actually constrain because he put his hand on one which wasn't lit up there, which was his left hand. So some of these don't suit his capability or his preference in terms of what is inviting him to hold on that rock face. So no results here, but this is something that's being explored right now, and the findings of this will be presented at the Nonlinear Pedagogy Conference by John Kulmer. So I'm just showing this up here, and this paper will be up soon, I think, but a nice example here of highlighting nested affordances that are working towards. So perceiving information that are linked to future affordances, almost 5 in a row here. Same on the rugby pitch, 3, 4 phases ahead. Some players can see opportunities ahead, which guides them. Once they achieve an action and a result, they'll see information for the next affordance. So that's nesting the affordances in that environment. Hidden, Some are hidden, some are not good for ill, and some invite. So I think the role of a coach is really to observe. Once you put these constraints into place, it's very much about observing, very much about picking up on tendencies and strategies that your athletes have. And when you go on that learning journey, a lot of that can determine what you do next as a coach in terms of what you manipulate, the questions you ask in terms of what's your intention there, what's your strategy. So I think that sort of coaching journey is really rewarding. Unfortunately, we don't tend to explore that much in our coach education. I think it sort of tends to be more when you're more experienced, do you feel more at ease coaching like this? That's something to look at maybe as well. Okay. Just aware of time here. So I'm going to, Ollie, how much time, how long have we been going on for, mate? It's about half an hour or 40 minutes.
Yeah, you've been going, what? Yeah, you've gone nearly 30 minutes. So
30 minutes. Okay.
Another couple of minutes, and then we can, we've had quite a few questions come through.
Okay. Just looking at the athletic development foundation movements. This is something I've put up there just from my experience. If you move down the left-hand side, generally we move from quite structured sport or technique or organized sport, and then we move down into an element of movement down the bottom over time. That's more of a traditional approach. If you move up on the right, we generally, kids move around in free space and free movement, and there's only a few principles involved in those sort of movements. Okay, team sports like go forward, invasion sports have general principles. I feel when the pressure is on somebody in a traditional approach, going down the left-hand side, if they freeze in free space in a team game and they're not afraid of what to do, or their movement starts to decompose, they go back to quite rigid structures. So the default is to move back up that continuum. I think if you start at the bottom on the right-hand side and move up from that free movement, free play area, the default is always to come back and free play it. And I've noticed that in team sports a lot, particularly with the French way of doing things and the English way within team sports. You tend to go back to where's the space instead of actually let's have a breakdown in the team sport so I can reorganize. So I think that general tendency looks at people being able to move and being able to adapt in the moment. And I think these basic movement skills have had a key part in this. So when you look at different sports through the age groups and the effect that they have in terms of what are their fundamental movements, I think it gives you a clear understanding of the role of donor sports and the role of putting in these additional basic movement skills in warm-ups, and also your seasons and the way you plan and through your early diversification of school pathways. A quick example.
Ways are back again, street places I didn't know. I broke everything new again, everything that I don't. Out the window came along. I know we'll part the colors of my sea. It's a perfect colored sea. To help me late at night. Places I have gone, they've never seen any light. Dirty basements, dirty noise, dirty places coming home. Alone, did you ever like it then? I would stand in line for this. There's always one in line for this. Sounds told me, they held me down every night. I didn't have much to say, I didn't give up the light. I closed my eyes, I closed down everything. I had to close my mind. Things could cut me, but too much to make me blind.
Okay, from the East German and the Russian system back in the day, and they had a lot of movement coordination wrapped in. So if you look at most of those movements, they combine, the basic movement skills are combined with more sports adaptive, technical or sports specific movements as well. So the combination of these are very rich for young kids. And I think maybe there's a movement more towards back that these days. Here's a very, very quick clip of a Swiss academy, school, which I really like. Okay, and then finishing off with how important that is for the elite players moving all the way through. So here we have an example of players still learning how to feel to control an opponent in contact.
So that in getting him off balance, if I'm pushing him forward, and I'm helping him. Yeah. If I come forward to you, it's actually adding to you. Yes. You control where it's going. Whereas if I go past,
Do it back. Feel it? Feel it? Do you mean it's like not balance?
Okay, so with that, George Smith's Australian. He's done lots of judo. He was a gymnast as well. He's done a lot of things. He's a very, very smooth, effective, good mover. Provides a lot more opportunities when you play in that position. So if you look at some of the players in our pathway, they tend to be quite rigid in their movements, probably too long in the gym or not enough sports skill effectiveness. So I think those are some of the limitations that we look at, particularly limitations with adaptability and movement. And I won't go through these now. Obviously, I'll leave this where it is, but we're going to look at, I've also talked about, and I won't go through it now, but the interaction continuum. That's effectively action along a continuum. So if we want to be adaptive, we should hang around that middle area. That's the metastable area, interactions. So in any sport that involves quite a lot of planning, get out of that planning area as quickly as you can into the interaction and the reaction. Use principles for that. I just wanted to quickly show you one clip here from the practice session of the England 20s. That's the coaching style for this approach.
Okay, we're in there. Defenders in. Okay, let's go. Play in there. Deep attack. Play it out. Play it out. What's it? Kick it, relax, man, please, come on. React to the breakdown, good. Play it this way, hold it there. Hold it there. Play, go. Yeah, but what's on the back of you? Hold it there, good. Well done. Position, where are you? Where's the defense? Okay, look here, defender, you. Let's go down. You've got the ball. You've got the ball now. Yes, I need you to react.
Okay, and I wanted to finish off with one of the coach in the English Pathways who spent a lot of time with him, and he really describes really well the environment that's needed for learning.
On the defence, that all our attacking decisions are based upon how they're defending, who's defending, etc., etc. So they're in front of us. None of our decision making is based on this. It's all based on that. So let's get our heads up. Let's play.
I mean, how we coached is just lots of condition games. We put some constraints in the game, so we kept on adapting the game, adapting the pitch, and just trying to get them to come up with some answers about how to do well in the game, basically, and how to stop the opposition. So that's what the theme is. All of the answers are in the game. So I try not to talk other than just to encourage and possibly give the game some shape and then challenge them and ask them some questions and stuff. But just play. We played 5 or 6 different games and trying to get them to come up with some strategies of how to do well and how to stop the opposition from doing well.
And all it there. Play with this ball. We'll swap sides quickly. You must bounce the ball to somebody you can't run in possession. So did we play this last time? This will be reasonably tricky because this is not that flat.
So from a coaching point of view, we're trying to coach players who have got game sense, who understand how to do well in games.
What did you see tonight? Did you see encouraging signs from the young guys?
Yeah, no, they were very good. They're prepared to experiment in the game. They're prepared to have a go in the game. So they're very adventurous, the younger players. They get less so the older they get, possibly a little bit overcoached at times. But so they certainly had a go. I thought the general skill level, so their decisions under pressure were good. Occasionally they're let down by the execution, which again is fairly common. The execution is the thing that comes last.
Okay, just on that last clip there, he said execution comes last. In team sports, we look at seeing opportunities and trying to act based on them, and the skill level obviously is layered on that as well. So it's providing the right opportunities for those kids to be able to explore and find solutions. And so the general templates are things like this. They start with the principles, there's themes, and then we look at the constraints, and then we talk about the skill or the behavior and the game evolution, and talk about some of the game information for coaches. Okay, so that's a bit of a wrap up, and that's using constraints to create adaptability within your athletes. And that's it. I'm just going to halt it there. And I'm aware I've gone a bit over time, so hopefully there's some time.
No worries, Rick. I think we've got questions come through. So we'll go straight to Phil, who's got some come through in the chat.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Rick. Really enjoyed the range of examples that you gave there. We're going to go over to Quiva Morris first. And Quiva's got a question, because some of the examples that you showed, that they wouldn't be very common over in Ennis on a Wednesday night. So her question relates to how you prepare coaches for that. So I'll pass over to Quiva.
Okay, Phil.
Yeah, cheers, Phil. Rick, thanks very much for that. That was really interesting. I guess I was just wondering on a junior rugby sort of setting. So senior men's rugby team who are in like a lower division, would say that they need that kind of movement introduced. How would you, or how do you communicate the benefits of those games, that kind of training? Sorry, I have a dog asleep on me. That's what you might see. How do you communicate the benefits of those kind of games to a coach?
Yeah, good question. If it depends the teams that you're working with, and I guess if they're quite a team that likes to do the things that they normally do, and they don't like a lot of change, I think you need to pick up on that. So it's almost picking up on the culture. What do they like to do? What's the way of doing things normally? And once you find out what those things are, then you find out how far you can sort of perturb that to a degree. I find there are certain individuals who will like it, and there's certain who find a little bit uncomfortable with it. But I'd inject some variation all the time. I would never do things the same every session. So as soon as you start to say, oh, let's go back and do this drill, there may be a couple that they quite like, but generally you should always change it, always tweak it, always scale something within that. So for example, if they like something, well, you go back to that, but then you scale it. So it depends what it is. It may go a little bit further, an extra 5 meters, an extra 10, you put 2 balls in there. There'll be some aspect or variable that you can change within a consistent drill or a consistent session. And what they do is they tend to get used, that they're comfortable starting off with that, but then it will vary, of course. And I think that probably the important thing is to give them the control. Once they start to engage in that, is actually then you ask the question, what else could we do with that? And then they take control over the game. So they sort of control the numbers, they control the rule, and they go on this journey of actually taking over the game itself, and they become the coach. So I think it's actually a trick is to remove yourself as quickly as possible, engage them, connect them to the game, and then sort of remove yourself from it as quickly as possible. And then really challenge them. Ideas, challenges is the key thing. Give an idea, let them run with it, and then challenge that idea as quickly as possible, and they will control that. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Caoimhe. Thanks, Rick. Our next question comes from Declan O'Leary. So Declan, I'm just going to unmute you now. So if you want to pose your question directly to Rick.
Hi, Rick. Thanks for a very interesting discussion. My question relates to coach development. The dynamic situations that you described can be very hard for a volunteer coach who's learning their trade, especially a coach of children. And what steps you could suggest in terms of knowledge or coaching skills they could go through to develop their ability to, I suppose, undertake skill development in which that the type of approach that you've outlined.
Yeah, a really good question. And when I got to England in 2013, the chap who you just heard on that video clip, John Fletcher, a fella called Peter Walton, and Ian Peel, who's now with Saracens, we developed a coaching education system that was different, and it was based on informal practice. So when John Fletcher coached, I would stand on the sideline and have about 30 or 40 coaches. And these were all sort of volunteer coaches. Some of them were working in the lower academy part-time. Some were very novice parents. And you've got to make them feel safe. First of all, make them feel safe. Make them feel that there's no perfect way of doing something. So there's no right or wrong. So make them feel safe and support. So I was there to support them. And what you do is you watch a session. So you use player development. So there must be some sort of coaching or player development going on at that time. And then you ride on the back of that. So you ride your coach development on the back of some form of player development session. You have to speak to the coaches. And of course, John Fletcher, Ian Peel, Peter Walton, Rusty as well, when he was there, we had the coaches on the pitch. So when the players were playing, they knew this was a coach development opportunity as well. So whenever there was a huddle, our coaches would walk over, listen in, come back, and then I would reinforce the key principles of coaching and player learning. So what we had was this really nice dynamic system, it was about the game of rugby. It wasn't about, sitting in a classroom. The classroom was actually the rugby pitch now. And when there was a learning moment for the player, I would turn that into a learning moment for the coach who was with me. And then we'd also listen to the other coaches coaching the players. And because they were quite good, Fletch would then look at my coaches and say, right, guys, any questions? And then, nope, all right, players, carry on playing. So it became quite relaxed after a while. And then my coaches, the 30 of them, they would learn in the moment. And then the questions started to become more and more about, oh, why are the players doing this? Oh, I see what you mean by this. And then we would go into the clubhouse, and then we would have about 30 minutes of questions, and then we'd run through all the principles that makes good coaching development or a good coach. And then the players would come in when they were ready after, having a shower. And then the coaches would ask them, oh, how did you feel when the coaches did this? And the players were like, oh yeah, no, this is real. I've never been coached like this. I really enjoyed it. I was able to make some decisions, or, it was different to my normal session. So you can carefully do it in a way where whichever development session you're watching, you can sort of influence the coaches that are with you. So I guess what I'm trying to say is try and marry up player development with coaching development, and try and find a system that works together.
Yeah, that coach development is as dynamic as player development itself is. So it's really, when it's done well, it looks really good. It's quite complicated to actually identify those learning moments, I think, that you described. But thanks, Rick. That's a great answer.
Thanks.
Thanks for that, Rick. We've got a couple of questions over on YouTube. One of them in particular is related to you mentioned that decoupling is almost a little bit less of an issue with advanced performers. And Jonathan Fisher wants to know specifically as it relates to practice design, why that may be so.
Are we going to go back to, oh, you're asking the question here. Oh, okay. Okay, I had a sort of a continuum at the end here somewhere, which sort of looked at this. If we look at, let me just try and find it. So if we look at, can you see my screen?
No, you'll have to share it again, mate.
Okay, so I'll just answer the question. So in effect, if you have a skilled player and we look at a continuum of a movement form movement effect. So on the left hand side you would have movement form, so how the player is moving, the technique, the coordination, the movement patterns. On the right hand side you would have the movement effect, the outcome of that movement. I would generally work from the outcome end. So I would always work from the outcome end, and then as a last resort, you move down the other end to the movement itself, if you need to. As you move down that continuum, you would have different affordances as a coach, different ways to provide information. So at the outcome end would be feedback about the outcome or the flight path of a golf ball, right down to the club head, right down to the movements of the biomechanics, the kinetics, what so. So that's just a very simplistic example. With an effective person who can control their coordination and their equipment, they're generally quite good at exploiting things. I think when you look at another continuum, which is internal, external, I think when you start to look at an expert, they tend to be able to relook at their coordination and work on decoupling. So I'll just give that example, that England player that was working with no defence. Timing their pass is not an issue for quite a skillful player. Timing their pass based on where the defender is something that a skilled player, they've got quite stable behaviours and they're coupled to those defensive information. If you take away that defensive information, it's not a problem for them. They can go back when the defender's there and then recouple again, because it's quite a stable behavior to couple off dynamic movements around you. So decoupling at a higher level, and this is only my personal perception, it's not a great issue depending on what you perceive the skill level of that person as. If you keep decoupling though at a very novice level and a very intermediate level for too long, they can start to, I reckon, couple movements off intrinsic timing mechanisms, or off when they're comfortable to do things. And I think there's a big danger in that, because the specifying information can get lost, and it will be very, very general transfer, which is something I think Keith touched on last week. So don't spend too long down at the decoupled end. Even for those experts there, we were only there for 10 to 15 reps, and then we would go straight into dynamic interactions.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, is that you're bringing it back into your dynamic interactions. We'll go to Mark O'Sullivan, because he's made a point on that in the comment box, especially as it relates to younger athletes. So once I find you there, Mark, I'll unmute you. So Mark, if you want to jump in, and Mark,
this will be, we'll probably wrap up after this question as well, just mindful of time. So apologies to those we didn't get to.
Do you hear me, Rick?
Hi, Mark. I can see you.
How are you doing, man? You all right?
Yeah, very good. Very good.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Well done. Nice presentation as usual.
Thank you.
Really nice. Yeah, it's just touching on that last question about the decoupling of perception and action in highly skilled players when you're just manipulating task constraints. And yeah, as you say yourself, that it's something you move away from rather quickly. But unfortunately, this is kind of the default setting in a lot of youth football, particularly with kids, and to especially when they're, like last week we had Keith speaking about learning to learn how to move, learning to learn how to play football. There's this default set, and it's very common in a lot of these products like Curver and things like that. And it's easy to sell in because it looks good and it looks great, and there's no chaos and it's nice and neat. But I find it personally highly problematic as a default setting for children, because it's they're learning to learn how to play at the time.
Yeah.
I just wonder what's your opinion of that, because I think you already touched on it anyway in the last question.
I agree, Mark, and I think I don't like to be fixed in my thinking. I like to be challenged, but I think you're right, and I think it's a case of what's our purpose. Kids are learning to learn how to move, and that's the purpose. The purpose isn't the execution.
Yeah.
So once we've agreed that, we make decisions and we design training around that. So of course there won't be any isolation. There won't be any isolated technical work, because that's not the purpose. And in fact, I think that can inhibit further skill. So it can actually regress or be negative transfer often. So I think that's really important. So kids need to find early diversification, as you know, Mark. There's many ways to do things, and there needs to be freedom of choice in movements. If kids feel free and have a free will to be able to perceive a situation and act on that situation, how they feel they need to act, we get genuine, authentic movement. And once we have that authentic movement, we can work with that. If we don't get that, then we're basically, for want of a better word, it's just play acting. We're just acting as coaches, and we get very passive learners as well, who just do what they think they need to do to appease us, the coaches. So I would warn any pathway or any sport or any system to keep going down that road, because it's detrimental to learning, and we will lose kids as well, of course. And look, there's no problem with a kid going and doing their own, knocking the ball on a wall and doing their own technical work. Of course they can, and we definitely challenge and support that. But look, I think we have a need.
If you got a group of kids at the session, you might as well utilize that, as opposed to, because like if the kid is playing the ball on the wall and his friend turns up, they make a game out of the ball on the wall.
Yeah, exactly. And
that's what I mean. And I think it's. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think interactions with things around you is important. Why should you limit the interaction? How somebody interacts with something, if you constrain them, they'll get frustrated. If you constrain them, you get artificial movement. So, you get artificial stuff. So for me, it makes no sense. But that's me. And, I think my role is as coaching development. I've moved away a little bit from coach development to coaching, which is talking to coaches one-on-one, explaining these principles, rather than doing workshops nowadays. And I think it takes time, because you have to work with someone for quite a while and challenge them theoretically and have a good underpinning and a good learning model. Otherwise, they tend to flip back to these ways. So, my message is to everyone today is some simple principles today. Keep exploring them and use people to help your coaching development in the future. But thanks, guys. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Good man, Rick. Thanks a million.
Thanks for that, Mark. Good to see you. So Rick, thanks very much for that. Really, I'm going to have to watch that again. There's so much in there. So yeah, just a big thanks for that. I'm sure everyone will agree. It was a pleasure having him on this afternoon. So, and also you can follow Rick on Twitter. His handle is @SkillAc. So yeah, really great. Just to wrap up from me, so a big thanks. Big thanks for tuning in. Keep an eye on our Twitter @MSAI Ireland. We do have some further great speakers lined up. Also, any feedback you have, please send that through on Twitter to us. And also you can view a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel, which is MSAI Ireland, which also includes our other two speakers on webinars that we've had in the last couple of weeks, and the speakers from our MSAI conference in 2018. So check that out. So great to have you on. Thanks once again for everyone joining in, and hopefully we see you again soon, and have a great weekend. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Ollie. Bye, everybody.